I would like to introduce our moderator today. He is the chair of the Chamber's State Government Affairs Committee. He's a member of the Chamber Board of Directors, and he is a director and shareholder at Gallagher, Callahan, and Gartrell. So please welcome our moderator, Ari Pollack.
Tim, thanks so much for the introduction. We have a distinguished panel for you this afternoon of legislative experts by way of introduction, and then we're going to have each come up, provide a short explanation of where they think the year is going to proceed, and then we'll have them join in a panel discussion with questions and answers. The first panelist, first speaker, Dave Juvet. Dave is a senior vice president and public policy and communications expert for the New Hampshire Business and Industry Association. He has over 35 years of experience in government relations, lobbying, public policy advocacy, media relations, and of course, marketing. Dave has been with the BIA since 2000 and is in charge of their internal and external communications, public policy development, legislative activity for the association, and has a supervisory role for their lobbying group. Our next speaker will be Phil Sletten. Phil is a policy analyst with the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. Phil previously spent 3 years as an auditor for the New Hampshire Office of Legislative Budget Assistant. So he's the good one to ask, can we pay for all these good ideas? And Phil brings a master's of public affairs from the University of Wisconsin with, again, an emphasis on tax and economic policy, very relevant to today's discussion. Our final speaker is Dean Spiliotes. Dean is a civic scholar with the School of Arts and Sciences at SNU. He is also the founder of a blog entitled NewHampshirePoliticalCapital.com. Dean's work focuses on presidential politics and policy, campaigns and elections, and of course, New Hampshire's role as the first in the nation primary. And I'm sure you all recognize Dean, or you'll at least recognize his voice from frequent contributions at New Hampshire Public Radio, and of course other media outlets. So without further ado, let me ask our first speaker to come up, provide about a 10-minute explanation of where he thinks the year ahead's going to go, and that's Dave Juvet. Thanks, Dave.
So good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Dave Juvet, and I work with the Business and Industry Association. Very pleased to be here and interested in hearing what my fellow panelists have to say. This isn't going to take me 10 minutes because if the question is, what do I think is going to happen, the answer is, I have no idea. So let's move on to our second speaker. It is going to be an interesting session. This is old news, and you've all heard of it before, but the House and Senate in New Hampshire switched in the last election from Republican control to Democratic control. And although the governor's office did not switch from Republican to Democratic control, and that's going to set up an interesting dynamic. But it is not the only dynamic that is taking place, and I think it's one of the things that will make this session interesting for people who follow politics in Concord. One of the dynamics that's going to take place is, well, what do the Republicans do now that they're not in power? Do they participate in the policy process? Do they try and shape it, or do they just sit back and say no to everything? Another interesting dynamic is what happens within the Democratic caucus now that they have power. When you're in the minority, it's fairly easy to keep a cohesive caucus. But when you all of a sudden have the ability to exercise power and you have the numbers on your side, that's when fissures start developing. And I think the fissures in the Democratic side, and I think this is true in the Senate, I think it's really true in the House, just by virtue of the numbers, is there are a lot of new incoming Democratic legislators who ran for a variety of reasons, but one thing they all have in common is they want to leave their imprint on this session. They ran for a reason. They have projects and issues and ideas that they want to see put in place, and it's full speed ahead. There are other Democrats who may share philosophically the same, they may be in the same place, but they also recognize that in some cases going full speed ahead means you'll be voted out of power 2 years from now. So they might take a more cautious, thoughtful approach. On major issues, they're going to agree, but I think there's also going to be this sort of restraining on the part of Democratic leadership to make sure that their caucus doesn't go too fast, too far, because they've seen what happens in the recent past when they do that. So it'll be interesting to see how big issues get resolved. We already know that some of their major policy issues, major initiatives, will deal with the family medical leave, coming up with some type of program for people who are out on family medical leave to be able to get some form of compensation while they're away from work. We know that there's going to be a lot of employment law discussed, everything from how employers the processes employers need to follow to hire people, to minimum wage issues. And certainly there will be focus on environmental issues, both energy, sustainable energy, and also emerging contaminants that have been mentioned often in the media over the past year. And then the final dynamic that I think no one knows, and I think there's a difference of opinion on this, is when these bills pass, if they pass with complete Democratic support and little or no Republican support, what does the Republican governor do when they hit his desk? And that's a big unknown too. There are some who believe, well, he's going to veto everything in sight. And that may come to pass. I don't believe that's the case, though, for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think it's in the nature of this governor. It doesn't seem his personality to do that. He will veto things. I mean, we have seen examples of that, but I don't think that's something he does lightly. And I also think if he has thoughts on his future political career, and honestly, I don't have any inside scoop on this, but if he feels like maybe a couple of years from now he might want to run for the Senate, U.S. Senate, if you have a record of vetoing everything in sight, well, that'll play well with the Republican base, but it probably won't play as well with that great group of independent and moderate voters in New Hampshire. So, I think he'll take that into account. But we'll see. So as I started this out by saying I really have no idea, I guess I'll finish up with that. I really have no idea, but it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Thanks, Dave. I think we're going to ask you to take your seat.
Okay.
Dave, thanks. I know I can cross off several of the questions I had prepared for the question and answer session because you've already answered them, or said you didn't know.
I don't even mind being asked the same question because I've already got the answer.
Oh, good. Okay. So we'll continue to populate our panelist table by asking Phil Sletten to come up. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just a quick word, New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, independent policy research organization that's based in Concord. We focus on state budget and revenue policy as well as economic policy and a little bit of health policy as well. So that's where I'm going to focus my remarks on today, to talk about what we're looking at as potential big fiscal policy issues going into this next legislative session. There are three main ones that we'll be watching. The first is Medicaid reimbursement rates, and I know that sounds a little arcane, but it's a big fiscal policy issue, and it's also a workforce issue. I'm sure I don't need to tell folks in this room that we've had an unemployment rate in the state that's below 3% since late December of 2015. And Medicaid service providers, so these are agencies that contract with the government or otherwise engaged with the government to provide services to generally low-income people, as well as those with disabilities and some elderly folks as well, who are receiving services that are covered by Medicaid. Those agencies that provide these services have been having difficulty finding and retaining workers. Again, this is not a surprise given the state of the labor market right now. The state does have some ability to set those Medicaid reimbursement rates. Many of those rates have not been increased for years or even more than a decade in at least a couple instances. So many of these agencies that are asking people to perform complex services, such as caring for folks with developmental disabilities, for example, are competing with what work in the private sector or in other agencies that may be less complex or be perceived as less difficult. And that means that services can go unfulfilled for people who are eligible for Medicaid services. And another component to this is under the new Medicaid expansion, the new version that we have now that's starting this year, the reimbursement rates for providers under Medicaid expansion are going to go down in the current model because of the shift to managed care organizations providing those reimbursements as opposed to the prior model, which was based in the individual marketplace and had higher reimbursement rates generally. So that means that those reimbursement rates are going to continue to be lower, or could be lower for that population, and because that's served through Medicaid expansion. So because these Medicaid reimbursement rates are sort of a challenge across the board, and if they're lower for these agencies, that means they aren't able to pay as high a wages to the folks who are providing these services. Now, I mention this as a fiscal policy issue because any time you make substantial changes to Medicaid, you're talking about a potentially quite a large dollar amount. Medicaid is a roughly $2 billion a year program in New Hampshire if you're talking about federal and state dollars combined, and there are a lot of federal dollars in the Medicaid program, but the state dollars are a significant component as well. And $2 billion a year, to give you some context, not all state spending is in the state budget, but the state budget is about $6 billion a year. So Medicaid is a very, very large program in New Hampshire that serves a lot of low-income people who otherwise may not be able to pay for health coverage in the state. So this is an issue if we're talking about increasing Medicaid reimbursement rates. You're talking about potentially many tens of millions of dollars at that point. So this is a big fiscal policy issue that has important ramifications both on the workforce side and for the services that are provided to people who are eligible for Medicaid in New Hampshire. And that's about 180,000 people who are on the program in some form or another. The second big fiscal policy issue, which has been a recurring issue in New Hampshire over time, is education funding. Currently, much of public education at the local level is paid for through local property taxes. Now, the state pays about $960 million a year, so just shy of $1 billion a year, through the adequate education grants that are given to local governments on a per pupil basis to help fund education. About a third of that $1 billion is raised through the statewide education property tax that is raised and retained locally, so that is also paid through the local property tax bill. And the adequate education grants start at about $3,600 per student. And usually school districts have an average cost per pupil of around $15,000 or $16,000. So it depends exactly on what you're including in those average costs, but the adequate education grants, which also have upward revisions for certain students, if you're a free and reduced price lunch student, if you are an English language learner, or you're a student with special needs, for example, the grant is a little bit higher. But this means that a lot of school districts are paying more in local property taxes to sort of offset that gap between what the adequate education grant pays and what the school districts typically pay. And property poor communities are more likely to struggle with that. And there's also a component of this called the Stabilization Grants, is something you may have heard of. That's a piece of the adequate education grant funding. Those are set to go down, and they are going down 4% a year, every fiscal year, 4% of the original value. That means that the school districts that are disproportionately impacted by that may see more than a 4% drop, for example. But that could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in their budget that then they are not getting from the state each year. Again, depending on the school district. Some school districts don't rely on stabilization grants at all. So there are several bills to address parts of this issue, including changes to the education funding formula itself. But any major changes that would increase state support could have a pretty large fiscal impact. There could also be another lawsuit pending. We had the Claremont and Claremont II decisions in the 1990s. If there's another lawsuit of that sort, that may put more pressure on the legislature to act sooner. So whether there's action this year or in a subsequent year is a question, but it's definitely going to be part of the conversation, especially because of that potential impetus. Related to of the lawsuit, related to this is, will we fund full-day kindergarten at a statewide level at full adequacy? We made some changes that led to more funding beyond the half-day level for kindergarten students. Will it be a blanket full-day funding? And that could also have a fiscal impact. Now, the third policy issue is revenue projections. And this is always difficult because the legislature is talking about projecting depending on what part of the process you're in, 2.5 years forward to see how much revenue are we collecting from taxes and lottery sales and liquor sales, for example, to fund the state budget. It's going to be very difficult this year. The federal tax overhaul from December 2017 has spurred a large increase in business tax receipts at the state level. These are some really large, suspected to be anomalous payments. So and to give you some numbers for this, the business tax receipts last fiscal year shot up in the spring of 2018. They were about 18% over the budget's plan and 22.5% over the prior year. And so far this year, they aren't calming down. They're about 34% over what we had this time last year and 50% over the budget plan. And they're also up in ways that are difficult to predict. So revenues from extensions that were filed as opposed to the more typical estimated payments or returns, for example, are up 378% this year. And if you just looked at October, they were up 4,000%. So these are basically, the upshot here is there's abnormal behavior in how business tax receipts have been behaving recently. And the economy is doing well, but much of this is likely because of businesses responding to the federal tax overhaul. And it's difficult to then have a base to project from. And business taxes are an important part of the picture in New Hampshire's revenue. There are also some other complicating factors. Business tax rates in New Hampshire are set to go down again in 2021. They just went down for 2019 for calendar year businesses. There's also questions about what happens to business tax rates, what are the policy decisions made around that, and that's part of the likely to be part of the discussion. We're also talking about projecting a budget for the next 2 years, which means that, since we're in the second longest economic expansion since the 1850s, what happens to the economy over those next 2 years is a very relevant question, especially for state revenues and what services would be able to be supported through the state budget. And the federal corporate tax environment is still somewhat unsettled. There's still a need to promulgate regulations for some of the rules that are associated with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from December 2010. So those are the three big ones. Some other issues to watch: the 10-year mental health plan is going to be something that's part of this state budget discussion. Opioid crisis funding is going to continue to be part of the discussion, as is funding for the Department of Children, Youth, and Division of Children, Youth, and Families. Funding for higher education will likely be part of the discussion, the university system and the community college system, as well as potential changes to Medicaid expansion, both the funding structure and the work requirements, especially given the challenges that Arkansas is facing in implementing its own work requirements, where nearly 17,000 people have been disenrolled because of them. And then paid family and medical leave, which Dave already brought up, will be, I'm sure, a part of the fiscal policy discussion. Two pieces of context to remember here as we're looking at some of the 800 some pieces of legislation that have been filed so far. There are workforce constraints that we're facing. We already talked about those a little bit. There's also a lack of housing inventory in the state. And those two issues are issues that are not going to be fixed by any one single bill, but those are ones that will be important to understand the context of some of these bills and some of these policy discussions that will be going on during this next session. Those are two big issues that legislators are aware of and maybe trying to respond to, but it will be difficult to try and tackle those in one bill. That won't happen. But that's a backdrop for a lot of the pieces of legislation that I think we'll see. So with that, I'm all set. Thank you very much.
Phil, thanks so much. And we're going to finish populating our panel table with Dean Spiliotes. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks, Ari.
afternoon, folks. I am very happy to be here. I've done some of these events before, and I always really enjoy talking to folks in the Concord area and getting people's political points of view. It's certainly helpful to me in forming my own opinions. So I've been asked to provide a little bit of political context to the upcoming legislative outlook. And I think it's fair to say that Governor Sununu is facing a changed political and legislative landscape in the wake of the 2018 midterm election. Now, we can debate whether there was a blue wave in other parts of the country, but in New Hampshire, the results were pretty clear, I think. This reminded me of the 2010 midterm, the Republican Tea Party rebellion, in which, as I expected, John Lynch was literally the only Democrat left standing as governor. Chief executives, whether we're talking about a governor or a president, they typically have two options or strategies in this kind of divided circumstance. They can choose to work across the aisle and seek some legislative common ground. This is the so-called tack to the middle strategy, and as I think Dave was saying, it helps keep moderates and independents tied in as a part of your base of support. The alternative, obviously, and I think Dave also mentioned this, is to wield the veto pen. And this is really a means of demonstrating to your core partisan supporters that you have not lost touch with your party's core ideological values, and you typically hope that the opposition party is unable to achieve an override. Typically, in this kind of situation, we see some of each strategy from a chief executive, and I suspect we're going to see the same from Governor Sununu. And this approach most famously reminds me of President Clinton in 1994. I mentioned 2010, but in 2010, the Democrats with President Obama still controlled the Senate. They didn't lose the Senate until 2014. So in 1994, we had the Republican Revolution and the contract with America, and a unified Democratic Congress was taken away from Bill Clinton. And as we know, he went on to achieve some legislative successes and maintain high popularity, even in the face of scandal with Monica Lewinsky and all the other issues that were dogging him. This was his famous triangulation strategy. Work a bit with liberals, which is what they were called back then, work a little bit with some Republicans. We had welfare reform and a number of other policy successes. So kind of just reminds me as kind of a possibility for how Governor Sununu might move forward, having lost both chambers of the state legislature in one election. My biggest potential concern, or the concern for anybody who is hoping that that will be the strategy, is that the core ideological bases of the two parties are much more polarized now than they were in 1994. The base of the Democratic Party in New Hampshire is more progressive, as evidenced by Bernie Sanders' big win here in the New Hampshire primary in 2016, and the agenda rollout we just saw from state Democratic leaders over at the State House. And at the same time, the base of the Republican Party has been almost completely remade in rapid fashion by President Trump. All that being said, Governor Sununu, in his inaugural speech, laid out a fairly centrist philosophy of politics. He talked about a New Hampshire way that is removed from the partisan polarization of Washington, and he drew an explicit distinction between how things function in New Hampshire versus how they're currently functioning in Washington. And he noted a desire to focus on individual citizens. He talked a lot about forming relationships with people that gets them out of their partisan comfort zone. He suggested that voters chose divided government rather than this is just kind of how the election chips fell out, that this was an intentional choice by New Hampshire voters to have this kind of balance between Republican and Democratic. He also talked about a focus on management and customer service, which may also serve to distinguish New Hampshire from the rest of the partisan political landscape. And it is true, if you remember at the end of his inaugural speech, he laid out a long list of priorities. If you listen to that, you heard a fair bit of overlap with the Democratic legislative agenda on things, and Phil mentioned some of them: mental health, opioid treatment, child welfare, public education. But as is always the case, even when there are areas of agreement between Republicans and Democrats here in New Hampshire as well as elsewhere, the devil is in the details. And that was certainly the case with the paid family medical leave debate that we had in the previous session, and that may continue going forward. Really sort of fundamental disagreements about what the program should look like, how you should fund it, who should be responsible for any potential shortfall in the program. So I think there's an interest there to work together on issues, but my concern is that the polarization of the two parties, let's say in comparison to 2010 or 1994, is so great, and I haven't even talked yet about the larger national situation, that may be problematic. So some areas that I'm watching, I think that will be pretty good bellwethers or indicators of how this is all moving forward between the governor and a Democratic state legislature. The economy. Democrats are going to push for a state minimum wage, would be my guess. Governor Sununu has already said that he's not interested in that. In fact, I was doing some post-election analysis on the Exchange the morning after the election, and Governor Sununu called into the show, and Laura Kanoy asked him flat out, would you support a state minimum wage? And his answer simply was, well, why would I do that? So that gives you an idea of the potential for conflict on some of these economic policies. So has shown no signs of having any interest in that. Democrats will try to block, as we've already heard, the next round of business tax cuts. I think they know, or I assume they know, that trying to roll back the first round would be a political loser. Once you get tax cuts, they're very hard to take back, regardless of who the intended audience of those cuts is. I think Democrats are going to try to funnel more state funds. We've already heard some of this. They're going to try to funnel more state funds into job training than we would typically see from a Republican legislature. A Republican legislature would be more likely to try to incentivize private sector behavior that then would lead to increased job training through the private sector. So I think we're going to have a debate there. A big one, I think, to watch, and I think Phil mentioned this, Medicaid expansion, the work requirements. About 15 states have adopted these work requirements for expanded Medicaid, and they're having some difficulty already with implementation. People are getting kicked off of Medicaid very quickly. They're having trouble figuring out how to report their work, whether or not what they're doing qualifies as work. So there are a lot of challenges of implementing expanded Medicaid work requirements. And as I said, the devil is always in the details. And if you listen to Governor Sununu's inaugural, he warned Democrats not to mess with it. I'm not so sure that they won't. I think we're going to have a potential for a real debate there again, even though it's already set to go into effect. Governor Sununu mentioned a desire to reform public assistance programs. This kind of fits in with my comments on Medicaid expansion. This is an area, public assistance, and how you reform it and who's affected and the kinds of requirements and unintended consequences of making change to public assistance programs, politically fraught and usually politically highly charged. So we'll see if he ventures into that area. It also seems like Democrats suspect that Governor Sununu is not on the same page with them when it comes to the future of renewable energy in New Hampshire. Governor Sununu has suggested a focus more on energy prices and an all of the above strategy and everything else. Democrats, certainly under Governor Hassan, had been moving more intentionally towards a renewable energy economy. So we may see some conflict there as well. You're also going to see Democrats bring forth, I'm pretty sure, some gun control legislation, marijuana legalization, which has become an increasingly popular topic given how attitudes have changed in the state and also how all the states around us have legalized in one fashion or another. And I think very importantly, you're going to see Democrats try to roll back some of the voter registration requirements. They may not be able to roll them back. I don't know that they can override a veto, but they certainly will try to get Governor Sununu on record yet again. There's still a lot of lingering animosity over HB 1264 and SB 3. So I think you can see the potential push and pull of triangulation that Governor Sununu will face. As I think Dave said, his strategy thus far from what we've seen is to kind of move back and forth. Give Democrats and moderates a little something, give President Trump and Trump supporters a little something, and kind of move back and forth. And he was able to put together a strong enough coalition to get reelected. But there are going to be real challenges for him going forward, because all of this is going to take place in the supercharged political environment of the next presidential primary. We're going to have a parade of national Democrats coming through the state, many of them pulling state legislators even further to the left. And we also have the ever-present specter of a primary challenge to President Trump. And we've already seen some attempts within the state GOP to undercut party neutrality in any potential primary challenge to Trump. So if both Governor Sununu and the state legislature are able to keep New Hampshire somewhat insulated, if they're able to stay on speaking terms, if they're not pulled too far apart by the larger national forces that are swirling around all of us, and they're certainly here from everything I'm seeing so far in 2019, there are real opportunities for success. I don't mean to sound overly jaded or gloomy, but the reality is, having studied this stuff in New Hampshire for about 25 years now, that can also prove quite difficult in practice. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Sure.
So we're going to open it up to questions. I can tell you I drew two clear conclusions from the remarks. First, New Hampshire has now joined the ranks as a state divided within a nation divided, and we'll spend the next few years trying to figure out whether there's a middle. The other conclusion, we have three extremely qualified panelists with us today, and they are trapped at the podium with me at your disposal. So let's open it up to some questions, and I'll start off with an issue I know that's been discussed in the chamber sessions, passenger rail service. We've heard the speaker come out strongly in favor of some form of passenger rail service. We've heard the governor go so far as to put it on the table when the Amazon pitch was timely, and that has come and gone, but nonetheless it was an event that occurred. Is there any appetite at the State House for an investment in passenger rail service? And what I mean by investment is something that would go beyond commissions and studies. And since this all has to do with whether or not we can afford it and pay for it, we'll put Phil on the spot first.
So I wouldn't be able to speak so much to the appetite. A lot of the discussion thus far has been around whether to accept several $1 million in funding to study the issue further and to do the design. Where that appetite sits now, I don't know that I can speak to, but in terms of the funding mechanism side and the economic development side, I think that there's potential for there to be movement probably at the more local and to the extent that local governments can cooperate regional level. The challenge there is that then that is likely funded through property tax revenue, and a lot of municipalities, even those down towards the southern border that may want to extend passenger rail, just over into their border, I'm thinking Nashua and Plastow, for example, you may still face, challenges when it comes to increasing property taxes in those communities to fund some of those initiatives. At the state level, I can't speak to the appetite. Obviously, then you'd be talking about different types of dollar figures. Considering we don't know, we haven't done the studies to know how big the number is, so to speak, at this point, for what that expansion would look like. I think there are enough questions at this point that I can't speak to the willingness. However, there's also, the private sector side of it is also part of the discussion now in terms of private sector provision of passenger rail. That's again, I don't know how that shakes out, but that's, I think, going to be part of the deliberations on the State House side.
Yeah, I can certainly talk to the political appetite. Throughout the 2016 gubernatorial race, Colin Van Oosteren was a big proponent of passenger rail, and Governor Sununu at the time had voiced a fairly standard argument. I heard from Republicans that commuter rail, particularly the ones that were the plans that were being proposed, would basically be a huge subsidy to the tune of several $100 million. So he's very negative on it. Although he has said if there's that seed money for a study and the legislature wants to do it, maybe that's okay. And then he had that change of heart with the Amazon proposal, which he said was sort of a very specific focus for rail. Although I didn't mention it in my talk, when we had him on the exchange the morning after the election, we also asked him about commuter rail, and he was back to we don't want to do that, it's a $300 million subsidy, and so it's not likely. So I can't say that there are circumstances under which he might not be interested in a private sector solution. I know it's a big issue with Democrats, certainly with progressives within the Democratic Party, but he's kind of gone from being opposed to, in a specific circumstance, putting it in there, to now he kind of sounds like he's a little bit more negative. At least that's my anecdotal sense of where we would be on that.
Yeah, I agree with Phil. I think the first effort will be to go after that federal funding that New Hampshire essentially said thanks but no thanks. And I don't know whether that's still available or not, but if it is, New Hampshire will certainly go after it to fund that feasibility study. Where the state goes from there, though, I think is a little more difficult. New Hampshire's constitution places very rigid constraints on how highway fund money, which is how transit in most other states is funded, can be used. And it's pretty clear that using highway fund revenue in New Hampshire to fund rail would, at the very least, trigger a lawsuit. And the other political dynamic is, although in general I agree that the Democratic Party and progressives are certainly look on transit and rail more favorably, the other reality is the further north you get from Concord, the less that support is evident from both parties. And it's because those representatives especially are saying, well, what's in it for us? You know, if this comes at a cost of having less highway money to fix our roads in the North Country, which already they feel they aren't getting enough attention, and if it means all the economic development that would likely come with rail is happening in the southern part of the state, where most of the economic activity is already happening, they don't see this as being a win-win for them. So I think there's both political ramifications and practical fiscal ramifications that make moving forward more difficult in New Hampshire than in other areas.
Yeah, and my recollection from the show was that Governor Sununu did say if there's money available to do some kind of study, he'd probably be okay with that. And that's a change from the past where the money was in and out of the budget repeatedly. So that's a separate issue from his seeming kind of overall negative view on a full-blown commuter rail development.
And of course, maybe like the rest of you, I'm still trying to figure out whether these trains would be bringing workers to us or taking them away from us. Let's open it up for questions. No holds barred. Who wants to go first?
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay. They're at your disposal and they won't last long. Yeah, please.
One mention of marijuana, I'd love to know what the thought is from the council on the cannabis coming up in the next year or two.
Who's our marijuana expert?
I'll start, and I need to have a caveat. The Business and Industry Association is neutral on that issue. We won't be advocating either in support or opposition. My instincts are that this may be one of the issues where a good number of Republicans would be willing to work with a number of Democrats to get it through both the House and Senate. I don't know what happens when it hits the governor's desk. And that's because I think there's a certain amount of Democratic support, but there's also Republican support, especially from the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, that thinks that's an issue that the state shouldn't be regulating. There's also an economic component that is attractive to some Republicans in terms of the ability for it to possibly be a revenue source for the state. So my perspective, although my organization is neutral on the issue, is my perspective is I see it as having a fairly good chance of passing both chambers.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. It's amazing. I remember back to how difficult it was to get the medical marijuana through and how long it took to implement. And now we're watching other states around us struggle with implementation. Massachusetts, it took a long time. My recollection of Governor Sununu is that he, from what I've heard from him, is that the view, and he's certainly not the only one to express it, that You know, he views marijuana as a gateway drug to other drugs, and in the middle of an opioid crisis, that's probably not something that you would want to put forth. That's my recollection of where he is on that.
I know the governor has certainly explained that he is opposed to legalization, and I would think if he's going to find his veto pen somewhere, it would be for that issue. And I guess the question becomes, you know, how determined is the State House, and can they have a policy of outlasting that veto? Others? Please, Councilor.
I was wondering, what do you think the chances or the opportunities for the state legislature to start returning some contributions to the retirement system to local communities?
Retirement system funding. Phil, that sounds like you.
So I'll give some background. So the state government used to fund municipal police, firefighter, and teacher retirement costs. And I should say municipal and school district police, fire, and teacher retirement costs at 35% prior to fiscal year 2009. Like a lot of revenue streams that were affected during the recession, that was reduced and then suspended starting in fiscal 2013. So as opposed to 35%, it is now 0% and has been 0% since 2013. There were several revenue streams, meals and rentals, tax revenue sharing, general revenue sharing, certain grants for projects, especially on the environmental side, for example, that were transfers from the state government to local governments that helped fund a lot of local government operations and, to a certain extent, decrease upward pressure on local property taxes. There is a lot of discussion around resuming or at least exploring how we can get some more revenue back to local governments, either resuming those revenue streams or constructing them together in some other form. I'll say that a lot of the difficulties around revenue projections, I think, make this a difficult subject to tackle in a consistent manner. One of the things that you hear from municipalities is that they might be they're more interested in having money they can plan on as opposed to one-time funds, for example. Whereas a lot of the discussion in some quarters around what these state revenues, especially the business tax revenues, are looking like. And the business tax revenues are important here because the rest of the revenue sources are sort of on par with where we expect them to be, or relatively flat, right? They aren't growing. Whereas the business tax, or they aren't growing substantially in aggregate, whereas the business tax revenues are why we have a $106.3 million surplus as of the end of December of this year. That may disappear in the future, but that's where it stands now. The nature of those increases in revenue that we've seen, I think, make conversations around consistent resumption of those revenue streams, like the retirement contribution, a little bit more difficult. But I know that there's certainly interest, and there's almost always some piece of legislation around this. I think there is certainly interest in tackling that in some fashion this year. With the framework being, during the recession, there were a lot of these revenue streams, including the retirement contribution, that were suspended. We are no longer in a recession. The economy's been doing well especially in New Hampshire, for the last couple of years. After a slow economic growth for the years immediately following the recession, New Hampshire's picked up in the last few years. So what does that mean? Why haven't those revenue streams resumed is part of the argument. So I think there is some appetite for that. Where it goes, especially in this context of revenues being difficult to project, I'm not certain.
Dave?
Yeah, I actually have a little bit more cynical point of view than my friend Phil has on this. I think there's no question, I think it's probably fair to say both parties would recognize the problem, especially with the unfunded balance in the pension funds. But both parties also have a long history of kicking this can down the road. And I think there will certainly be discussion, but the revenue parameters don't change based on who's in control of the House and Senate, unless there's some unlikely new source of revenue, which I think is really unlikely. So they're going to have the same revenue constraints that past legislatures have had. And I think, when all is said and done this session and into next session, there may be some tinkering around the edges relating to state and municipal pensions, but I just don't see that there will be any really meaningful reform.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
What can we expect to see with regard to attracting or retaining young professionals, given our very low unemployment rate and given the need to enhance that gap that is quickly being generated between retiring boomers and...
Right. Workforce retention and growth. Dave.
I'll start out on that, and I'm sure my panelists will want to add to it. I think the legislature recognizes that as a primary issue, and in discussions I've had with both House and Senate leadership, there are a couple of initiatives. One of them we touched on, the family medical leave, whether you call it paid family medical leave or family medical leave insurance, or however you want to characterize it. They see that, especially the Democratic caucus, as being an extraordinarily critical piece of legislation to make New Hampshire a more desirable state for people, young families and also older workers to move into. In fact, the Senate Democratic caucus feels so strongly about it. Their family medical leave bill is going to be SB1, the first Senate bill out. None of us really know what it's going to look like once the process is done. I think the Senate version, because there will be both a Senate and a House bill dealing with this, I think the Senate version will be similar but different in some critical ways from the effort last year. I think the House version may look a lot different from what passed the House last year. We'll see how it all shakes out. But in any event, public policy leaders view New Hampshire not having this as being a disincentive for people to come to this state to seek employment. The other area that I know there's going to be a significant effort, and I think, again, this will be driven on the Senate side, relates to the job training fund. And that's a fund that currently exists. It's paid for by employers through a portion of their unemployment insurance tax. It's a relatively modest fund now. $1 million goes to job training and $1 million goes to the community college system for their New Hampshire Works educational programs. The proposal that I have not seen in writing but have heard would be to almost triple that to $6 million. Certainly that money could be well used, there's no question about that. I think the conversation or the public policy debate will be how much from the unemployment insurance fund can you direct to job training without putting the fund at risk if there's an economic downturn.
Yeah, we really mentioned, I think, a number of the components that would go into attracting more young people to stay here. Everything from housing and education. We talked about all full-day kindergarten, family medical leave, cost of education, even commuter rail. I've heard some people argue that the millennials and younger workers prefer to use rail, so maybe that's something that might be a potential attraction. So the issues are out there every session, and the key is kind of bringing them together in a compelling package. And as I mentioned in my initial comments, there are real debates between Republicans and Democrats about how you incentivize or fund job training versus, say, doing it through tax cuts. But the issues are all there, and I think there's a sense among the legislature that you can build on a lot of them to get more people to stay here. And I think there was a study that was out recently that said that the in-migration of younger people is uptaking for the first time in a long time.
Other questions? We have time for one, two more. Yeah, right here in the middle.
Okay, so I guess I'm kind of piggybacking off of the same thing. So I know the governor is very adamant about not passing anything on minimum wage, but like you said, all of those are factors. So what do you think is going to be the first thing that they're going to work on? Because if I'm from Texas, and I use this as an example a lot because their minimum wage is also $7.25, but the cost of living for a 2-bedroom apartment is $800. Like, and on top of that, like their energy, my best friend's apartment for 106 degrees in the summer is $100. I paid almost $200 in July, like here with Eversource. So there's like so many different factors, and I know you kind of briefly touched on them. So I guess I'm just really interested to see what they're looking to do first, and if it really is a priority, because I think it's a very important for the longevity of the economy in New Hampshire.
If I could take first whack at that, I'm sure Phil has a comment too, because I think our organizations actually differ on this issue. I think in terms of attracting people to the state, the minimum wage is almost a non-issue. There are very few employers in New Hampshire that are offering jobs at the minimum wage. Even fast food restaurants, the starting wage is often $10 or more. The salary and compensation is an issue where New Hampshire is not necessarily in a very good position competitively. And the issue isn't at the minimum wage level job. The issue is more higher wage jobs, professional jobs, where we're competing with the Boston market that is easily, it's an easy commute to get to Boston. And the salaries down there from members in our organization are telling me are 30 to 40% higher than what equivalent jobs would pay in New Hampshire. So they're having a hard time finding this professional workforce who is willing to take the job at lower pay, although you could argue the cost of living here is lower than it might be in the Boston metropolitan community, but it's not that much lower.
Yeah, one of the things I'll mention, so the tight labor market does tend to help people at the lower end of the wage earning spectrum, and we've seen some evidence of that in New Hampshire. We do have the lowest minimum wage in the region. Everywhere else in New England is $10 an hour or higher, and we're at $7.25. Even if the number of people who are making that actual minimum wage of $7.25 is low, there is still potentially some ladder effect. If you raise the floor, then people may earn more, beyond that because of gradation and seniority in your workplace and that sort of thing. You mentioned the cost of housing in New Hampshire. The median house, or the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, if you include utilities, is $1,300 a month, and that's statewide. If you're looking at Rockingham County, it's about $1,450. And energy costs are a part of the picture as well. Whether it's natural gas or electricity, definitely compared to Texas, we have higher electricity costs in the region. So those are all things that do factor into, I think, whether it's the attraction of young professionals or retention. I think that when it comes to the young professional component of it, where you'll hear that the most is probably around funding for the university system, the community college system, some of these education-related initiatives that are designed to provide incentives for young people to stay in the state, maybe have to get their degrees more easily in the state, find work quickly after that in the state. Some of that, a little bit more seamless integration between education systems and the private sector. I think, the governor mentioned some education initiatives in his speech. I expect funding for the university system to be an issue put in that context. I think another important component is going to be this education funding piece. Because even if and I think this is part of what we were seeing in some of those statistics around the 2013 to 2017 in-migration that we've seen, one of the pieces that I think New Hampshire has a lot of strength in that's not recognized in terms of attracting young people is that even if we lose people right before college or right after college, New Hampshire is a very attractive place to live for people who are in their later 20s or in their 30s who are thinking about, where am I going to raise my children? Like, if we decide to have children, then where are we going to raise them? Where are we going to move to? What environment do we want to move to? And that's where school districts, and full-day kindergarten is part of the school districts, can make that argument that if we have more funding going to school districts, and it's maybe less reliant on local property taxes, especially if you're talking about differences in school districts across municipal or school district borders, that's, I think, where a lot of that discussion is going to come in when it comes to attracting young people who may not be young people who are, right out of college, or keeping them in state for college as opposed to going out of state. We do have relatively high tuition here, for example, in state tuition. I think that will be part of the discussion around if we're attracting people to New Hampshire, what's the demographic that we're targeting? If it's young people more generally, then there are certain other amenities that I think will come forward, and public education is, I think, going to be part of that discussion.
It's almost 1 o'clock, and so that means we're going to wrap things up, but it would be a tragedy to let Dean off the hot seat without, and I know Steve Dupree isn't the only one that wants to know Dean's opinion. Is New Hampshire likely to hold on to, in the short term and long term, the first in the nation primary? It's your turn.
Will it hold on to its status?
It's first in the nation primary. Do we do a good job of it, and do we deserve it?
I think we do. I think it's still a useful place for candidates to come and set up their organizations and vet their message and get some experience in grassroots politicking. You can no longer do that in relative privacy because of digital technology. If you come after it early and you make mistakes, it's immediately goes viral nationally. And I also think the nationalization of our campaigns, in large part because of technology and campaign finance, the amount of money, is a little more nationalized, but I still think that there's a role for New Hampshire. My expectation is that, I think we will, certainly for the foreseeable future, but there are these cyclical challenges that come up every year. Steve, more than anybody, could speak to that, having had to fight this, certainly in the Republican Party, and the Democrats have done that as well. So I think so for now, but it's, you have to be diligent because everybody wants a piece of the game.
Okay. Thank you all for coming out today, and I know you all join me in thanking our panel.